Hello again, this is Dr. Chris Fleming from the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at the University of Western Sydney. This is Philosophy and the Good Life and our wrap-up of Week 3. Now, Week 3 we focused all of our attention on Socrates, an ancient Greek philosopher, and for very good reason. It's impossible really to have any course on ethics without at least touching on ancient Greek thought. The impact of Socrates has been absolutely enormous, not just on Western philosophy, but on Western culture as a whole. In fact, in the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead, an influential English philosopher, said that all of philosophy really is just a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, Plato, you'll probably remember, was a student of Socrates, and really the only reason we have any idea about what Socrates taught and how he lived is because of Plato's accounts. Now that raises a whole series of other questions, of course, but the important thing to note is that Socrates himself did not in fact write anything down, or at least didn't write anything down that has been preserved. Now that doesn't mean that philosophy itself begins with Socrates. Philosophy actually predates Socrates, although not by much, probably about between 100 and 200 years. But the focus of philosophy before Socrates is very, very different. Really, the focus on philosophy prior to Socrates, and Plato's writings, in other words, is metaphysics, or even closer to what today we would think of as science. So the questions are really about the physical world. And a typical question might be, what is the nature of reality? What kinds of things are there? Is there something behind all of reality? One kind of substance? Of course, the most famous answer to this was given by Democritus, who said that the basis of all physical reality is something called an atom. Now, that was quite a good idea, and it lasted a long time, at least till the 20th century, when we split the atom. But this was kind of the flavour of philosophy until Socrates came along. Now, Socrates changes the emphasis of philosophy and its focus from one that is outward directed, that is looking at the world, to one that is inwardly directed. So the question for Socrates is not what are the basic constituents of reality, but rather it's not out here, but it's about the self. Who am I, and how should I be or live in the world? Now that was, of course, Socrates didn't invent ethics. People, of course, had senses of good and bad, or good and evil, but the way that was usually transmitted to people was through what we'd call exemplification. That is, pointing out. If you want to know what courage is, you would just point to a character in one of Homer's myths, the Iliad or the Odyssey. Or you would say, well, if you want to know what courage is, look at your uncle. But of course, there's no seeking for a definition or a philosophical definition of what these things are at base, and Socrates really changes that. And I characterize that in the seminars as the shift from mythos to logos. That is, from a kind of narrative account, a mythical account, to something using just reason. Reason by itself that is hopefully going to arrive at a conclusion that is satisfactory. So we found out very early on that he, in fact, by questioning a lot, by asking these very, very basic questions of important and influential people, he got into a lot of trouble. In fact, 3 Athenians laid charges against Socrates. He was brought to the Athenian court. He was charged with corrupting the young, with heresy. And all sorts of other accusations that he was a liar, that he was a sophist, and so on. And he was sentenced to death. He could have escaped, but he chose not to and drank hemlock and died in 399 BC. And so this is really the fate of Socrates. And the reason being is that the kind of method he operated by did upset a lot of people. He walked around shoeless, in one cloak, as far as we're aware, and walked up to people and started talking to them. Now, he did have a lot of influential friends, but he would talk to anyone. He wandered about the Greek agora, A-G-O-R-A, which is like a public, what we'd call a mall now, except it's largely for talking rather than simply for shopping. And so this was really his mode of operation. He didn't have a school. He didn't charge money. And this was kind of very different. There were thinkers around called sophists who charged money for teaching something that seemed like philosophy, but it was really a kind of rhetoric. And that is how to appear impressive and sound good for the purposes of making money or attaining power. And this was charged for. Now, Socrates, the traditional way of thinking about it is Socrates is the anti-sophist, or someone who challenged the sophist a lot. In fact, some sophist thinkers appear in the dialogues, and Socrates gets the better of them. That defeats them in argument and so on. So, what I then went to try to point out, and we did a quick exercise, was about looking at Socratic method, which is really the case that you try to make a basic statement, you know, what is courage? You make that statement. The example from Laches in the reading was, well, courage is never retreating in the face of enemy fire, never going backwards. And Socrates says, well, what about the case in that battle when we did go backwards, gained strategic advantage, and then won? And Laches has to say, okay, well, we've got to revise our definition of courage and so on. Now, this is not just, he's not just playing a game of, can I refute you? This has very important implications. For instance, that if you have a military leader who thinks that courage is simply moving forward all the time and any backward movement is cowardice, you're going to put your soldiers into a dangerous kind of situation, or a situation that they're in a dangerous situation, but a situation that's more dangerous than it needs to be. Further, Socrates enlarged the conception of courage so that it included not just soldiers and by implication men, but was involved, was something that was evident in multiple different spheres of life. So this is, and if you could probably get the sense by applying this Socratic method, which is kind of making a statement, trying to find an exception to that statement, revising or abandoning that definition, and on, that if someone was doing this to you, even if they were very gentle and they were a good person, that this may irritate people, and indeed it did irritate people. In any case, what Socrates was trying to do was live a particular kind of life. And towards the end of the seminar, what I pointed out was living a good life, what the Greeks call eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia is usually translated as happy. And that's not a bad translation. But it can involve happiness. But happiness, in the way we use the word, can be fleeting, right? You can say, how are you going? And someone says, I'm happy at the moment. Ask me in an hour. Maybe I won't be so happy, right? But this doesn't make sense of the Greek term eudaimonia, which can only really be applied to a life, okay? And you want a happy life. And this is really the purpose of Socrates as he tried to provide one living example of what philosophy could be. Now, this is one of the ways we can consider him a philosopher. It'd be very unusual these days to think of a philosopher who wrote nothing. Okay, but Pierre Hadot, in the reading, which is one of the readings that the first assessment is based on, is that there's a distinction between philosophy and philosophical discourse, just like there'd be any kind of distinction, you know, between playing tennis and books on tennis. And what Socrates was doing was engaging certainly in philosophical discourse, but it was a kind of life, philosophy as a way of life that you would want to, through exercising virtue, have a good life. So that was really where we wound up this week. We're pressing on next week and starting to move on to the next most influential thinker, Aristotle, and looking at his ideas of virtue and so on. So I'll leave it there for now, and take care and have a good week. See you next time in class.